Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today we'll be presenting on building beautiful, fast dashboards with Grafana and ClickHouse. We'll give you an introduction to how Grafana works with ClickHouse and then give you a bunch of expert tips as well as ideas for things that you can build. Before we get into the webinar as a whole, I'd like to just make you familiar with a few things that will help you enjoy it more. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and we will publish links as well as to the recording as well as the slides afterwards. So you don't have to take frantic notes. We'll be sending it out to you if you signed up. The second thing is that we will have time for Q&A at the end, and you can also ask questions at any point during the webinar simply by typing them into the question and answer box, which you can activate from one of the buttons on the bottom of your screen. If you pose a question that's relevant to what we're talking to, I'll probably stop and just answer it right there. Otherwise, as I say, we'll have time at the end. Finally, speaking of the end, we will do a poll. It's very quick. We'd appreciate if you would stick with us and fill it out. It will take you literally 15 seconds. It's just 3 questions that help us build better webinars in the future. Okay, with that, I'm going to proceed. So my name is Robert Hodges. I'm CEO of Altinity. For the purposes of this talk, though, I'm a dev and I've worked for over 30 years on databases as well as topics like virtualization and security. ClickHouse is one of many databases I've worked with. It is basically number 20. I also have with me today Eugene Klimov, my colleague. He's responsible for integrations of ClickHouse as well as management. But most importantly, he is the Grafana ClickHouse data source maintainer. He will probably not be talking because he's actually in a time zone that is very, very far away, but he's tracking the conversation to be able to help answer questions. Just a little bit about Altinity, which is our company. So we're the #1 enterprise ClickHouse provider. We basically make enterprises successful in building analytic applications on ClickHouse. We offer hosted ClickHouse in Amazon, Altinity.Cloud. We're also a major committer as well as a community sponsor for ClickHouse, particularly focused on the US and European markets. And maintaining the Grafana plugin is just one of the many things that we do in the open source environment. So with that, let's go ahead and just do kind of a level set to introduce ClickHouse and Grafana, since I assume there's a few people here on the call who may not be using one or the other right now. So let's start with ClickHouse. So the way that I like to explain ClickHouse is, imagine if MySQL and Vertica is a popular proprietary data warehouse, got married and they had a child. Well, from the MySQL side of the house, that child would be ClickHouse. And from the MySQL side of the house, we would have a single binary. It understands SQL. It runs practically anywhere, and it's open source. And that's exactly those are all properties of ClickHouse. It turns out that ClickHouse actually even has some resemblances in the language, because the folks who wrote, many of the people who have committed things to ClickHouse know MySQL very well. So we've imitated the language. Now, from the Vertica side of the house, we get data warehouse capabilities. These include the ability to store data in columns, so that you can think of them as big compressed arrays, which are very, very efficiently stored. We have the ability to do both parallel and vectorized execution. So parallel, being able to spread processing across many cores on a single host as well as many, many hosts. Vectorized execution, we're able to take advantage of what are called SIMD instructions, single instruction, multiple data, which allow us to for example, add up multiple things at once in a single execution, in a single clock cycle. And of course, since it's a data warehouse, it scales to very, very large amounts of data. There are clusters that run as many as 500 nodes in various locations. Of course, when you're just starting out, you can run it on a laptop. So tremendous variation in the amount of data and the scale of computing that it supports. And a final thing about ClickHouse, which is something that really sticks out for most new users, is it's incredibly fast. I have a demo that I do, which shows there are actually cases where ClickHouse can read faster from storage than it can generate the same information in memory. It's very, very quick. So that's ClickHouse. It's exceedingly popular. It's very easy to get. You can start it in 60 seconds and be off and running. What we want to do is talk about combining it with Grafana. And Grafana is a display tool primarily, but not entirely, for time series data. It makes really great dashboards. So it has its kind of a native understanding of what it means for something to be a time series. So it has some time component. You have notions of intervals. You have notions of rates. Things like that are all kind of built into the model in Grafana. It's very simple to install. We'll demonstrate that. It supports lots of data sources. I'd like to say ClickHouse is the biggest one, but it's not even close. Many people use Grafana on things like Prometheus, on MySQL, on Postgres, Druid. It supports a wide variety of databases. There are many display plugins, so there's all kinds of, and we'll show some examples of those. It's also really interactive. So if you're looking at a graph, it's very easy to zoom in, for example, on a particular section of time series, play around with it, and be able to drill down further into the data. It's incredibly popular across the board for monitoring dashboards. That's one of the primary use cases where we see Grafana, and I would say that probably half of the people that we know that are using ClickHouse are using it that way. It's also open source, which means that it fits in well with the ClickHouse model. And finally, it's just beautiful. It has probably the best, the most interesting looking graphics of any of the products on the market. So this is what we want to combine with ClickHouse. So here's basically a little model that shows the connectivity between these two systems. So at the back end, you have the ClickHouse server. So that's going to serve up your data. And there may actually, I show just one server here, but it could be many. They could be behind a load balancer. It could be a cluster with even hundreds of nodes. It doesn't really matter. It's just ClickHouse will be, or excuse me, Grafana will be talking to it. And excuse me, in this talk, we show a couple of ports. These are using something called the HTTP interface, which basically means that we speak the HTTP protocol when we're talking to ClickHouse from Grafana. And there's a couple of ports that are that you'll need to know about or get used to. One is 8123, and that's for unencrypted HTTP, and the other one is 8443, and by convention, that's for encrypted HTTP calls. We'll see more, we'll look more at that as we go along. Grafana itself typically runs as a server, and it will serve up the dashboards, which contain a bunch of JavaScript, which then pops up in your browser, for example, Chrome or Firefox or something like that, or Edge, whatever, and will actually show the dashboard. So this is the basic flow that you have. So you need a browser. That's easy. We've got one right here. You've got Grafana, which you'll install. You'll have to have ClickHouse with some data in it, and then you're ready to go. As far as ClickHouse goes, one of the things that we are able to offer people is a test endpoint. So we have Altinity.Cloud, which is managed ClickHouse in the Amazon cloud. And one of the things we do is we have a public endpoint, and these are the connection parameters for it. So if you're testing out Grafana and you want to, for example, use some interesting data, you can use this public endpoint. It's read-only. The password and the user are shown here. We'll actually be using this in the demos. It's super convenient for for building dashboards. And some of the data sets that are out there are airline on-time data, plus a table that you can join with to show your airport names and locations. We also have a full history of GitHub events from the beginning of time. That's about over 3 billion rows. And then we have a trip data table, which is New York City Taxi Commission ride data. It's a famous data set. This version has about 1.3 billion rows. So these are kind of nice data sets that you can point your dashboards to and then illustrate how Grafana works. So with that, we're ready to just talk briefly about how to set up Grafana. We're going to do a couple things here. We're going to show, just for ClickHouse people, how do you set up Grafana both locally as on Ubuntu as well as using Docker, and then we'll talk about connecting to ClickHouse as well. So the setup on Grafana is really easy. I do this all the time because I typically do most of my dev work on Ubuntu. The commands here that are highlighted in black are what you have to run. This can be done in a couple minutes if you have a good network connection. So you're just going to load the Grafana.com repository so that Ubuntu can see it, see the Debian packages. You're then going to go do an apt install Grafana, and then a key step is the ClickHouse support is not built into Grafana. There's a bunch of in-tree data sources. ClickHouse is not one of them, at least not yet. So you have to, once Grafana is there, you have to execute this Grafana CLI plugins install command, and that installs the Grafana or the ClickHouse Grafana driver. And then whenever you do this, you just want to restart the Grafana service so that it sees it and can work. One thing that I should point out here, the name may be a little surprising. It's called the Vertimedia ClickHouse data source. That's a historical artifact. It was developed by a company called Vertimedia. The guy Roman, who was the initial was the initial developer of it, was working for Vertimedia at the time. He's since gone on to other things. We still talk to him, but we're actually, Altinity is now the maintainer of this, but we left it in the same place to avoid confusion. So that's your setup on Grafana. Pretty easy to do if you're using a Linux laptop the way I typically do, or if you have a VM somewhere. The other thing you can do, which is very handy, for example, if you're running on Mac and don't necessarily want to run Grafana locally, is you can just run it in Docker. And one of the cool improvements recently in Grafana is it's gotten better at installing the non-tree plugins. And so this command that we show you right here is actually going to pull down Grafana, get the latest version. It's going to automatically install this Vertimedia ClickHouse data source. That's the ClickHouse Grafana plugin, and it's going to it'll pop it up, and then you can basically start talking to it. I do a port mapping here of the Grafana normally runs on port 3000. I map it to 3001, and that's because I was running the previous example, which brought it up on 3000 already, so the port was taken, so I remapped it. You can also do this in Kubernetes. Grafana runs super well there. We do that quite a bit ourselves. We have a blog article that tells how to do that, plus you can find instructions for that on the net. So that gets you Grafana. Let's have a look at how we connect to ClickHouse. So when we're, excuse me, when you first bring Grafana up, you're actually going to have to go ahead and log in to Grafana for the first time. So for example, this shows the URL on my laptop that I connected to. It'll ask you to change the password. That's always a good thing to do. And then what you'll need is to add ClickHouse as a data source. So I'll just show you this. We'll go in and take a little tour in just a minute, but this shows you basically where you go to get this done. So when you come in you have to come in as an admin, and what you can do is go to there's a little wheel here. That's where the tools are. And there's a section on data sources, and you can go in there and add a data source. So, and if everything has gone correctly, you'll see a long list of data sources, starting with the built-in ones like Prometheus and Graphite. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see your ClickHouse plugin sitting down there, and you can just go ahead and click on that one. Once you have it up, you just fill in the information, test it, and save. So for example, you're going to give the URL, and in this case, we're going to use the endpoint, the Altinity.Cloud endpoint, because it's convenient and we can see it anywhere. Another important thing for connecting to ClickHouse is Grafana has a couple ways of operating dashboards. One is that all the queries to the databases go through Grafana itself. so the browser doesn't talk directly to the database. This is the recommended way to use ClickHouse. The alternative is to have queries come straight out of your browser. This sometimes doesn't work because there are some issues with CORS support in ClickHouse. If you're a front end or full stack person, you'll know what I mean. Basically, ClickHouse does not support what are called pre-flight requests, which are necessary for most modern browsers to talk to it if ClickHouse is running on a different host from your Grafana server. So we recommend using this default server. You'll want to sign in with and you'll use basic auth for this. So I've got that highlighted, the settings here, and you'll add the user's demo. You'll add your password. It says configured because I've already entered it. And then another thing which we recommend is to use the post request to send queries. You can either use posts or gets. Posts are better. We'll show an example of this actually further on in the talk, because the query gets sent in the body of the talk. And so if you have a problem with it, it's really easy to go look at it, see what's going on, maybe copy it somewhere else, debug it, so on and so forth. We'll see examples of that. And then finally, you just go ahead and do save and test. And you should expect, if you're doing things correctly, that things are actually, you would expect to see data sources working. If you don't, you have a problem. So what do you do if you have a problem? Well, if you can't connect to ClickHouse, the next thing you do is kind of look up how ClickHouse URLs work, because that's probably where you've made your mistake. So I've got a couple examples here that show the URLs you can use to connect to ClickHouse, and we're using the curl command here because we're actually able to execute them and see what comes out. So this first one is simply connecting to a local server using unencrypted communications. It doesn't have credentials. It's got sort of a host name and a port, and this will just return OK if you run this command. So this would tell you, yes, the server's there and it's live. We're actually connecting to a ClickHouse server. The fact that it's unencrypted and no credentials in a production system would be terrible. In this case, it's no big deal because it's actually running in my closet. So the only way that somebody's going to get in is if they burgle the house. So this is a pretty typical URL that you might use for development purposes. Now, if you're actually going to a production system, you'll have a URL that looks more like the one shown below. So we're encrypted, we're using HTTPS, we've got the credentials baked in. You can also pass them in through a header. We've got the host name, we've got the port. And then what we're doing here is it's a post. So what we're actually doing is we're going ahead and echoing a ClickHouse command in, and this will bring back the version of the server. So this is another example. From that previous screen, if it didn't work, I would go ahead and probably do something like this and try and figure out what I'd done wrong. So I hope that's helpful. There's more information in ClickHouse about the HTTP interface. If you run into trouble, I definitely recommend checking there if you need more information. So at this point, we're going to build our first dashboard. And so the process when you come in to build a dashboard in Grafana is you basically can start a new dashboard, and then you're going to add panels to it. And you can, as you add each panel, you can go in and edit it. You can apply the panel, you can save the dashboard, and you can just keep doing that until you have something that you're happy with. And so when you get started, you come in and it looks kind of blank. In fact, this is one of the biggest problems I had with Grafana. I was just wondering what to do at the beginning. You just hit this plus sign on this in the Grafana console, and then it will pop up a new dashboard, and then you can start adding panels. You just press that button. It's easy to get started, but the first time you do it, you might look at it and wonder what to do or how to get the dashboard started. I have some more slides about this, but rather than do that, I think I'm going to stop right here and we can actually go look at a real one. So we'll go ahead and we're going to make a panel. So let me go, and here's my dashboard. So if you can see that, let's and this is just these are exercises that I put together for this talk. So it's not designed to do anything particularly glorious. It is an example of a dashboard that's built using the airline data that's available on the airline on-time data. So let's go ahead and actually make a new panel. So we see the existing panels. They're not so exciting. We'll look at them a little bit more later. But let's go ahead and add a panel. So let's go. We're going to move it and put it somewhere where it doesn't totally block the screen. And so we'll add it. And now that pops us into an editor. So we're going to do a very simple panel, which is actually going to have a table in it. And the first thing that we'll want to do, excuse me, to make this work is we're just going to go, there's a little query editor. We're just going to go and add a query to it, which is going to tell Grafana to go fetch some stuff. So let me just wipe out that sample that it supplied, and let's go get the query. Here it is. So what we're going to do is just construct a table, well, you'll see in a minute, of popular airline destinations based on the flights that go to them. So we'll put that query in. Oops, it just disappeared. Okay, there's a little pen here that you can hit, or pencil. Sometimes when you want to move around in Grafana, that's how you bounce back and forth between different panels. So there's our query. So we've got the query, and what's cool is there's a preview screen up here, which is going to show us our data, but right now it's not showing anything because it doesn't quite know how to display it. It thinks we want to do a graph. So let's help it out a little bit. Let's tell it that it's a table, and there's the table. So so now it's showing up as a table, but it's showing time, which means that Grafana thinks that this is time series. In fact, this is just a table. So let's go ahead and help it out a little bit more and tell it, hey, this is tabular data. It's not actually a time series. Once we do that, the panel basically pops up, and here we have the 10 most popular airports by the number of flights that have arrived there. So that's all you have to do. That's a really simple example of creating a panel inside Grafana. So you just add the query, select something to display it, make sure that it's, tell it that it's tabular information. We can go ahead and apply that. And now that we've done that, excuse me, we're now inside Grafana, and there's our table fully populated. This is one of the reasons why people like Grafana so much, because it's really easy to add these panels and then play around with them, move them around, reshape them. It's a very, very nice editor. So having seen that, let me just show you one other thing. We'll go quickly look at the, just to recall the data sources. So, oh yes, we want to save the dashboard. So here's our data source. Let's go ahead and look at that. And that just shows you the example data source that I set up. So this is just, again, you go to this wheel here, you hit data sources, you select it. When you're adding another data source, let's go ahead here. So again, this gives you your list. These are things that I showed you on the slides. You can just cycle down, and there's ClickHouse sitting down at the bottom, ready to be used. So that's the demo. Or a quick demo. What I like to do is now come back to the slides. And by the way, if you have any questions about this, feel free to go ahead and post them into the question box. If I see them come up, I'll answer them right then and there, or we'll answer them at the end. Okay, let's go ahead and look at how to do a time series graph, because this is where things get a lot more interesting. So we have, when we go into the editor where we were before, we could see 4 sections. So we have the data preview, which is incredibly useful. You'll see this little arrow here, or this little exclamation point in the red corner. That means, hey, something's wrong here. Either I don't have data, or your query is messed up. So that says I have work to do. Here's the query editor with the sample. Over here in the upper right, we have information about the panel, like its title. I can give it a description, and then we have a bunch of information about visualization and other options. In this particular case, selecting, hey, we're going to do, it comes in by default saying we're going to do a graph. So in order to get a time series information set up, we're now going to have to give ClickHouse a little bit more information than we did the last time. So let's look in more detail. We're going to go to the query editor, and we're first of all going to make sure that we're selecting ClickHouse. There's only one data source configured, so it will pick this up automatically without us doing anything. But the first real work we have is to go ahead and in this from field, we set the database name. So it's called default, and the table name is on time. So that's telling ClickHouse, or excuse me, telling Grafana where it's coming from. And you'll see how that gets used in a second. The next thing is Grafana's got to have a time series column. So there's this column here where you'll see column date time. And there's also two other data types there. If you scroll down, you'll see them. What you're doing is telling Grafana, hey, this is the data type we're going to use. And what we have to do is go ahead, and Grafana to process time series is going to want is basically going to want something with millisecond accuracy. So what we'll do is type in to date time, the flight date, basically convert it to a date time format. And then that will make Grafana happy because it'll know, hey, this is the thing that I use to compute intervals on the graph. There's also a field here, column date, which is kind of obsolete. I don't recommend using it. It will probably go away, but it's a vestige that's based on sort of the older way that ClickHouse used to organize data. And then finally, there's a super important button here called the Query Inspector. This allows you to debug queries. I spend a lot of time there, and we'll see an example of it in a minute. So this is your data source setup. We'll now go into the and define the query. And in this case, the query is going to look a little bit different because we're going to use something called macros. And these are things that Grafana will automatically expand out to become syntactically correct SQL for ClickHouse. So we'll, for example, select the time series, and that will fill in the right column name as well as the right expression. We will select the table, and that will automatically expand to the database and table name. And the time filter, that'll put in a select, like a where clause that selects for the time interval that we're looking at. So it looks pretty much like regular SQL, except it has these macros. There's actually a bunch more of them. I'm not going to bore you with the list, but there's a number of things that where you can set these in. If you just type $ in the editor, it'll expand out automatically and show it. This one here, we want to format it as time series because that's letting Grafana know that this is really time series. And at this point, it's basically done. Except it might be broken. So a good thing, something that commonly happens with these queries is that you won't get it right the first time. And fortunately, what you can do is you can just press that query inspector button that we had there, hit that, and then it will bounce you into this really convenient debugger panel. And what you can do is go ahead and you hit refresh, and then you'll see down here the actual query that you sent. And if it's screwing up, you'll see an error message there as well. This is super convenient, and this is why we like Post, because you can just cut and paste this out of or copy and paste this out and stick it in somewhere else to debug it. But here you can see the expanded query that resulted from those macros. And this is one of the reasons you want to use them, because it generates these kind of complex expressions that you would likely get wrong. And then you have finally data. So it's basically a bunch of JSON data that's coming out. This is super useful and enables you very quickly to figure out what's wrong with a query and fix it. Sometimes it's not enough to fix it inside Grafana. So if you really have a query that's got you stumped, a really helpful trick is ClickHouse itself has a built-in HTTP interface, like a real JavaScript interface. It's very simple, but allows you to actually run the query. And what I did was I took that query, copied it, and then if I go to this URL, so it's /play, and then you give the user, it will pop up, ClickHouse itself will pop up this screen, and then you can go ahead and debug your query. You have to, the demo user will get populated automatically. The place where the dots are, that's your password. You have to enter that. And what I normally do is put a limit in. You also need to be aware that whereas Grafana likes JSON, ClickHouse will only support normal output. So you have to play around with the play around a little bit with the format as well as limits, but it's pretty easy to use. And this shows that the query is running just fine. So so that's basically what you need to do for the most important, one of the most important features of Grafana, which is to graph time series data. So just in summary, you have the column date time, which you're going to have to set when you're doing a time series graph. We don't recommend you use column date. If you put something in, you may need to do a little work to get it back out again. Typically, just putting a space in where the name of the data is sufficient, or a column name is sufficient to make it disappear. You've got these macros, particularly time series and time filter are very valuable ones to use. They will automatically ensure that you can support ranges, and then make sure that the format is time series, and then Grafana will be happy. For all visualizations, including time series graphs, you add the query with macros in the editor. Use the query inspector to debug. You can use ClickHouse clients to pull it, and then of course there's this super convenient web client which is really available since version 2011. That's very, very helpful for this kind of debugging. So that's the basics on Grafana. We'll come back and look at the examples in just a second. In fact, why don't we just, I'm going to take a brief pause and we'll just look at that. Go ahead and to cement this, just look at that query. Let's get back to going back to my dashboard, and we can go ahead and look at the, have to get back to my dashboard. So there's my dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and here's my time series. This is the one I was using for that example. I'm going to go ahead and edit it. I see the nice I see the nice graph. Just to illustrate, so here's my query. As I said, showing my different macros. An interesting thing is you can put alerts in. Grafana now supports those. I don't have a good example of this because I don't have the server configured for it, but you can put alerting in. And then of course, if we want to see those parameters like the to flight date and the database and table name, that's available here. We can debug the query as we showed before just by going into the query inspector, hitting refresh. There it is. And this is where I can just copy and paste it out, leaving off the format JSON, and go execute it in another client. So all very convenient. And then one quick thing, let's go ahead and just change this very quickly to just to illustrate. This is line graph. It's great. Let's make it a bar graph. So we'll take the lines away, and that's actually not showing what we expect. It's showing way fewer flights because they're basically overlaying each other. Let's go ahead and make that a stacked bar graph. And in fact, we can show some other features. This is just really cool. We can now zero in on the data, show much smaller ranges, and Grafana does this very, very well and very quickly. Okay, so that's the example. Let's look at some more advanced tricks that we can do with Grafana. So we'll go back to slides for just a little bit. Let's look at function macros. So most of the Grafana plugins seem to have macros at different levels. As far as I can tell, there's no standardization. It's just whatever the plugin supports. So the ClickHouse Grafana plugin supports what I call function macros, and they will actually generate an entire query. So for example, that time series that we were just looking at, I can actually generate it simply by having this macro where I give a couple of columns and I say, hey, it's from the on time table. And what that does is it generates this much larger query that's shown here. This is sometimes useful because some of these some of these queries are complex to create, but this basically gives us the same sort of information. So this is a very useful approach. One of the things that you can do is, well, there's a bunch of them. So for example, there's a columns one, which gives you sort of, takes the carriers and uses them as keys, and then has an array of of uh, values per interval. So these can then get mapped onto a graph. We also have things like rate, and this is actually a very useful one because many counters that we're measuring in ClickHouse and elsewhere are monotonically increasing, like the number of inserts. So this will take something like, for example, out of the ClickHouse system tables and turn that into a rate, like the number of inserts per unit time. So rate in columns combines the previous one. There's a way to compute the rate change per interval. Actually, this is on counters. I got that backwards. I don't actually use these too much. You can check these out in the documentation. One thing that we do recommend is that if you're using them, it's often helpful to you can use them to generate the query, and then sometimes you can just take that query that's generated and go tweak that, and you'll be happy with that. Or you can continue to use the macro. They're documented in our on the page for the plugin. So that's handy. Another thing that's pretty cool is selection variables. So selection variables give us the ability to have selectors at the top of the dashboard. And for example, we've defined one that allows us to pick a particular query or a carrier and zero in on the information associated with that airline carrier. So this is the editor. You can actually click on it when you're in there, and you can get much more detailed editing. But what that does is it creates a variable which you can now use to select in your queries. And so $carrier becomes a variable that any query can use, and that will show data for the current query, for the current carrier. So you basically have to put it in yourself, but Grafana gives you a simple way of defining the drop down and then populating the variable. So we use that feature quite commonly for things like, like getting information about specific tenants, getting information about specific airline carriers, so on and so forth. You can also use these selection variables in titles. So here's an example of the dropdown that gets created for this one. WN is actually Southwest Airways, and you can actually put that into the title in this graph, which is showing arrival delay for over time. So that's another feature that we use pretty heavily. Finally, one of the really interesting things that I find super useful in Grafana is the ability to do multiple queries that feed into a single display. There are many ways that this can be used, but one handy one is you can use it to construct a pie chart. So for example, let's say that we have a pie chart that is going to show the top 5 carriers by the number of flights, and then another slice of the pie that shows all the rest. So what you're going to do is actually define 2 queries, which you're going to independently add to the same panel. So the first one is your top 5, and then the other one is all the rest. And so this shows the trick to doing this. We group by carrier, order by the number of flights in descending order, and take the top 5. And then the other query orders them, but it's going to actually it's going to order them, but it's going to take the 6th one on to whatever is the maximum number. I know I don't have more than 1,000 carriers, so I just use that as a limit. And so that's basically going to give sort of give this final chunk of the pie. And it's actually important to how you name it. If you name it others, it will match this sort of others chunk of the pie, which is something that's supported by that plugin. So when you actually put it in, it looks something like the following. Here's the pie, and there's my top 5 airlines query. So that's one query, and then I added another one called the remaining airlines, and it has exactly the text we just saw a minute ago. So that's a cool trick, and there's other types of displays which will happily consume multiple queries in the same panel. There's lots more cool things you can do in Grafana. This is actually one of the fun parts of my job is to build these displays, and many of you, I'm sure, on this call have done far more complex things. Let me just show you a couple of interesting things. Let's go back and look at these. So we have the the new dashboard. Here's the pie. Let's just have a quick look at how that was done. And we'll go into edit. Oh, it seems like it's unhappy here. That's interesting. So here are the queries. And we have our SQL. The pie chart, the way that those lined up. So we have the pie. We are showing a legend. We're getting, having it do percentages, and then that label others is actually important for the, apparently has to match up with the column name. So that gets you the pie. We have the other things that we've put out here. What I did want to show you was a very cool thing that is now quite straightforward to do in ClickHouse. So, or excuse me, with ClickHouse and Grafana. This is using Grafana 7.4 and the latest ClickHouse release. This is a fully developed dashboard showing all the things that I was sort of playing around with, but nicely formatted and put together. We're looking at Southwest Airlines. We have 35 total carriers we could look at, flights by carriers, so on and so forth. Here's a really interesting geographic panel. So let's go ahead and just view it using the ability to zoom in. And this is basically telling us, hey, what's the average number of canceled flights per unit of time, which I believe in this case works out to days. But what's cool is you can actually add, in addition, you can assign colors to it, and then the bubbles show the size for the airport. So for example, in this one, San Francisco comes up as 3.25 average canceled flights. What's happening here is that you see a bunch of very large number of canceled flights around places like Charleston, for example, and the East Coast. I have a feeling that this actually shows us a hurricane. I didn't go back to look, but basically there were a bunch of canceled flights during this interval along the East Coast. That usually means some sort of storm problem. If we extend it out to longer intervals, the oops, doesn't look like we have data there. Let's try 2 years. Aha. Looks like we have a problem with refresh here. Never mind. You know how demos are. Sometimes they don't work. Anyway, I think you get the idea. It's a really cool demo, and this kind of geographic display is pretty easy to do now with ClickHouse. So that concludes the specific things I wanted to show about ClickHouse and Grafana itself. So there's just a little bit of wrap up here. Let's go ahead and expand this out. So how to get started. So if you're new to ClickHouse, feel free to hit up the clickhouse.tech documents. That will that's where all the reference documentation is for the open source ClickHouse. The ClickHouse plugin itself is available at this URL. You can also find it if you just go to Grafana and look for plugins. And as I say, again, for historical reasons, it's called the Vertimedia ClickHouse data source. It has a long list of things that you can do. The dashboards, Grafana Labs has this cool feature where there are stored dashboards. So a version of that airline dashboard that we saw is available there. There's also other fun dashboards that do things like monitor SQL queries inside ClickHouse. There's a number of dashboards that are designed for network flow log management, so on and so forth. And then finally, to find out more about Altinity.Cloud and using it directly, or getting your own copy, check out our site. We've got documentation on that. So in summary, ClickHouse gives you very fast query on very large data sets. So you'll notice that as we did those examples, that was a small data set. It had 196 million rows in it. And it's coming off a small computer sitting in my closet. The query results are basically instantaneous. The Grafana plugin for ClickHouse enables you to connect Grafana dashboards to ClickHouse and build dashboards very rapidly. We're the maintainers for that plugin. It has an active roadmap because we use it pretty heavily ourselves, and we're also quite happy to, if you run into things, let us know. We're glad to fix them. We have some plan. We need to do a refresh on the docs, for example, and we're and we're also there's some various small features that we would like to do to make this easier to use. And then for quick prototypes, if you just want to go and look at some of the available data on the Altinity.Cloud, please go out and just try the Altinity.Cloud public endpoint. You can't do much damage out there. If you weigh the system down, we'll basically just chop the query. So, but it's a pretty performant system. So this is a quick way to get started. With that, I'd like to thank you. It's a pleasure to present on this. I'd be delighted to answer questions if you have them. What I'm going to do is start a poll here, and you'll see this pop up on your screen. If you'd be so kind as just to fill this out. 3 simple questions. They're just designed to help us do better webinars in the future. While you're doing that, feel free to contact us if you're using ClickHouse and would in anywhere, be it on-prem or in the cloud, to talk about how to build systems on ClickHouse, what kind of services we can offer. We do free 1-hour consultations. We do free trials for ClickHouse or the Altinity.Cloud. You can get 2 weeks for free. And just other resources, our website is altinity.com. We have a blog, which is quite popular. So for example, you can read more about using Grafana on that blog, and you can always contact us using info at clickhouse.com. So I see responses coming in on the poll. That's great. Let me just check. I don't see any questions. 1 second, let me make sure that they're not showing up. Oh, wonderful question. I love this. I've got, how does Grafana compare to Apache Superset? Superset also provides connector to ClickHouse, and it comes with built-in, with those charts built in, including geospatial. Yeah, Superset is a really good comp to a really good comparable product. We work with both of them. So the Grafana support has been around longer, but we're also working very closely with Max Boschema and the rest of the Superset team to ensure the driver support is there. One thing that we're fixing over the next couple days is we're going to move. We're working with the Superset folks to use the right SQL Alchemy driver. I've been testing that over the last couple of weeks. It works great. We know of one right now. We know of one sort of minor bug, but overall it looks really super. And I like Superset a lot. The Superset and Grafana are basically my favorites. So if you're comfortable with Superset, absolutely use it. If you're comfortable with Grafana, use that. Either way, you've got welcoming communities, and we're around to provide support for both of them. So as well as those communities. So one thing that Eugene pointed out was Superset right now can't be combined with Prometheus and Graphite. So it's harder to combine infrastructure and business metrics in the same dashboard. Let's see, is it possible to integrate Grafana into a page? That's a really good question. You could use an iframe, but I think you're thinking of something else, which is to actually embed it in a JavaScript application. I'm going to assume that's what you're asking. You have like a full stack application, and you'd like to plug Grafana into it. As far as I know, that is not easy to do. Grafana kind of wants to own that whole frame that you're executing in. So you could put it in an iframe, but that means you can't control like you can't. It's a little bit harder to control the interactivity. What we find is that people use Grafana. Grafana is really heavily used for infrastructure monitoring, and as Eugene pointed out to me, because it's, it integrates with this wide range of sources, including very tight integration with Prometheus, which is pretty standard for infrastructure monitoring. What people actually do, if they want something where they want to control the interactivity, they end up building it themselves. So and it looks like Eugene may be sending an answer. So there's a question here, do it vice versa. I'm not sure I understand that. I hope that was helpful. And definitely feel free to contact us, and we could or ask that question out on the Grafana forums. That would probably be your best bet. So yeah, and Eugene is confirming from his many time zones away that we can share the dashboard as embedded iframe code. So we actually do something like that ourselves because we use Grafana to monitor our Altinity.Cloud. So we have cases where we need to, for example, we need to proxy the Grafana pages. Okay, let's see, just looking, let me check the chat again. Open for, I hope this covered the questions. I'll hold it open for another minute or so. We're happy to ask other questions. In the meantime, I'd really like to thank Eugene for all the help in setting up on this. Eugene did most of the dashboards. Oh, thoughts on using on CH proxy? That is a really good question. So I'm not a CH proxy expert, but the question is the thoughts on using CH proxy. I've seen cases of Grafana killing the ClickHouse performance when a query isn't quite right. That is definitely a possibility. And I'm just wondering what you're thinking of when you use CH proxy, whether you're thinking of using query caching, for example. Looks like Eugene is maybe typing an answer to you as well. I think in general, if you have a query that's misbehaving and beating up ClickHouse, my first step would be to grab that query out of the query editor, go stick it in my favorite client, and sort of find out why it's misbehaving. That, so I would go fix the query. I'm not sure that CH proxy is necessarily going to be always the right answer, but you may have different experience on that. Okay. Let's see, could I go for CSV stored finance marketing data containing equity date, open, high, low, close, volume? Okay, so there's two questions here, and I'm going to answer this the way I think it might have been asked, which is if you've got CSV data, can you read it in ClickHouse? And there's actually a couple answers to this. So you're going to need to, so you can do two things. One is you can just leave it in CSV, for example, living in S3 files, if you want to read it from ClickHouse. And ClickHouse actually has what are called an S3 function, which can read these files directly. And as long as you give ClickHouse a schema, give it a description of what the fields are, it will actually run queries directly off S3. The second thing you can do is instead of running those queries, you can just load the CSV. You can insert all the CSV into a proper ClickHouse table and then query it there, again using this same S3 function. So that typically, if I had CSV that I needed to process, I would get it someplace where ClickHouse could see it, and best of all, have it actually in a ClickHouse table. And the reason that you want to do this is if the CSV is of any size whatsoever, it's going to be far better to have it in a ClickHouse table, which is highly optimized for speed. So for example, it has column format so that you only do IO on the columns you use. Those columns are compressed. We have the ability to knock out sections of the columns that we don't need to read. You may see performance differences of, up on the order of 1,000 or more, depending on what you're doing. So I would definitely think about loading it into ClickHouse, and then of course you can happily handle it there. Okay, I think that's it for questions. So I would like to thank you all. Oh, okay. So um, today I use MySQL and process a lot of data by procedures. For Grafana, I've set up a view layer. Hey, here's something you could do. You can actually select data directly off MySQL tables from ClickHouse. So if you're in MySQL, one of the things that ClickHouse can do is actually it can see MySQL tables. I haven't tried it on views, but it certainly works great on tables. There's something called the MySQL table engine and the MySQL database engine. I'd recommend you have a look at those. And if you have data in MySQL and you'd like to make it visible from ClickHouse. Okay. Well, I think that we're at the end of the presentation. I would like to thank everybody for the questions and that you've offered, as well as um, attending the webinar. I hope it was useful. Oh, by the way, final late coming answer, tricksterproxy.io. If you have concerns about performance, try Trickster. That was actually, I think the ClickHouse support was actually written by one of our friends at Comcast, I believe. So tricksterproxy.io, that's a solution for query caching. And with that, I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for attending. We hope this was useful. Encourage you definitely to contact us if you have further questions, or go ahead and post out in the Grafana community. We'll be out there and watching for things, and I hope to see you there. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Eugene. I really appreciate the help. Talk to you soon. Bye.